Maya Chen wiped down the last booth at Romano's family restaurant, her feet screaming in protest after 14 straight hours of taking orders, delivering plates, and forcing smiles at customers who treated her like she was invisible. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m., which meant she'd been awake for nearly 22 hours, having started her morning shift at Carson's Diner, across town at 5 that morning, before rushing here for the dinner rush that never seemed to end. Her reflection in the window showed a 26-year-old woman who looked a decade older, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide anymore, her black hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started neat 12 hours ago but now looked like something a bird might nest in. The tips from tonight sat in her apron pocket, a collection of crumpled singles and loose change that might, if she was lucky, add up to $40, which was exactly $40 less than what she needed to keep the electricity on in her studio apartment. Her manager, a balding man named Frank who smelled perpetually of garlic and disappointment, was counting the register at the bar, his thick fingers moving over the bills with the kind of speed that came from doing the same motion for 30 years. Maya thought about asking for an advance on her paycheck, but she'd already asked twice this month, and the look Frank had given her the last time made it clear that a third request would result in her looking for a new job, which was something she absolutely could not afford to do because jobs that paid under minimum wage plus tips were apparently the only ones her associate's degree in communications qualified her for. The restaurant was one of those places that tried to look authentic Italian with checkered tablecloths and photographs of Sicily on the walls, but the pasta came from Costco and the family recipes were printed off the internet, which didn't stop wealthy tourists from filling the place every night and leaving terrible tips because they assumed the automatic gratuity was already included. She'd moved to Seattle 3 years ago with dreams that now seemed laughable, convinced that her degree and her determination would be enough to land her a position at a marketing firm or maybe a PR agency, but the reality was that every entry-level position required 3 years of experience and every experienced position required connections she didn't have, so she'd ended up here, slinging overpriced mediocre Italian food to people who would spend more on a bottle of wine than she made in a week. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she didn't need to look at it to know it was another automated message from her landlord's payment system reminding her that rent was overdue, as if she could somehow forget that the threat of eviction hung over her head like a dark cloud that followed her everywhere she went. The kitchen staff had already left, their laughter and rapid Spanish fading as they headed out the back door, leaving behind the smell of industrial cleaner and old cooking oil that had seeped so deeply into her uniform that she couldn't get it out no matter how many times she washed it. Frank finally looked up from the register, his watery eyes meeting hers with an expression that might have been sympathy if he was capable of such an emotion, but was probably just indigestion from sampling too much of the carbonara during service. He told her she could go, that he'd finish up, and Maya didn't need to be told twice, grabbing her jacket from the hook by the kitchen and stepping out into the cool Seattle night where the rain had finally stopped but left everything wet and glistening under the streetlight. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and the next bus wouldn't come for another 40 minutes, which meant she had time to count her tips and calculate exactly how far short she was going to be this month, a ritual she performed almost nightly that had become as familiar as breathing. She pulled out the crumpled bills and smoothed them on her lap, adding up the numbers in her head because her phone was down to 3% battery and she needed to save it in case of emergency, whatever that meant anymore since her life had become one long continuous emergency with no end in sight. $42.60, which brought her total for the week to just under $300, and she needed at least $800 to cover rent, electricity and the minimum payment on the credit card she'd maxed out paying for her mother's medication 2 months ago. The thought of her mother made her chest tight, that familiar guilt settling in her stomach like a stone because she hadn't called home in 2 weeks, couldn't bear to hear the disappointment in her mum's voice when she asked how the job search was going or whether Maya had met anyone special. Questions that felt like accusations dressed up in maternal concern. A car drove by, splashing through a puddle and sending a spray of dirty water toward the bus stop, but Maya saw it coming and moved just in time, this small victory feeling monumentous in a life where victories of any size were increasingly rare. The text message came through at 6 in the morning, jarring Maya awake from a dream where she'd been swimming in an ocean made entirely of unpaid bills. She grabbed her phone, squinting at the bright screen in her dark bedroom, expecting another automated reminder or maybe a shift cancellation from one of her jobs, but instead it was from Denise, a girl she'd worked with at Romano's 2 years ago who'd somehow managed to land a job at Meridian, one of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants, where tech billionaires and visiting celebrities dropped thousands of dollars on tasting menus that consisted of 9 courses of food that looked like modern art and tasted, according to Denise, absolutely incredible. The message was brief and to the point in that way Denise had always communicated, telling Maya that Meridian needed someone for a private event tonight, that the pay was $300 for 4 hours of work, and that Maya needed to respond within the hour, if she wanted it, because Denise was already texting 2 other people. $300 for 4 hours was more than Maya made in a week at Romano's, and she was texting back her acceptance before her brain had fully processed what she was agreeing to, her fingers flying over the screen with the kind of speed that came from desperation. Denise responded immediately with an address and a time, telling Maya to dress in all black, professional but not formal, and to arrive at the service entrance at 5 p.m. sharp, because the client was apparently very particular about timing and presentation, which probably meant some tech CEO who'd made billions selling an app that did something nobody actually needed, but everyone somehow wanted. Maya dragged herself out of bed, her body protesting every movement after yesterday's double shift, and stood under a hot shower for longer than she could afford, watching the water bill climb while she tried to convince her muscles to stop aching. Her closet revealed the sad truth of her wardrobe, a collection of work uniforms and worn jeans, with exactly 2 outfits that could be considered professional, one of which she'd worn to 3 job interviews last month, and the other which had a stain on the sleeve that she'd never quite managed to remove. She chose the stained one, figuring she could keep her left arm angled away from people, and spent 20 minutes with a hair straightener trying to make herself look like someone who belonged in a room with billionaires, which was harder than it sounded when your face advertised exactly how tired you were. The bus ride to the Meridian took an hour, cutting through downtown Seattle where the contrast between wealth and poverty played out on every block, gleaming high-rises standing next to tent cities, Tesla dealerships across from soup kitchens, the whole city a monument to inequality that Maya had become numb to through sheer exposure. She arrived at 5 p.m. exactly, finding the service entrance down an alley behind the restaurant where Denise was waiting with 2 other servers Maya didn't recognize, both of whom looked significantly more put together than she felt, their black outfits crisp and unwrinkled, their hair styled in ways that suggested access to products Maya couldn't afford. Denise pulled her aside, speaking quickly and quietly while the other servers checked their phone, explaining that tonight's event was a private dinner for 8 people hosted by Maya Chen, the CEO of Tech Venture Solutions, one of those venture capital firms that decided which startups lived or died based on PowerPoint presentations and market projection. The name Chen caught Maya's attention because it was her name too, though she knew there was 0 chance of being related to someone with that kind of money, her family being the kind of Chens who ran a small grocery store in Sacramento and counted every penny twice. Denise continued, telling Maya that Marcus Chen's father would be attending, that the old man was apparently visiting from Italy where he'd retired 20 years ago, and that this whole dinner was basically Marcus showing off for his dad by renting out Seattle's most expensive restaurant for the evening. The setup was simple enough. They'd be serving a 7-course meal prepared by Chef Antoine, who had 2 Michelin stars and an ego the size of Mount Rainier, and Maya's job was to deliver plates, refill glasses, and be invisible unless spoken to, which was basically what she did every day anyway, except with much worse pay. They were led through the kitchen where Chef Antoine was screaming at someone in French about the temperature of a sauce, past gleaming stainless steel surfaces, and sous chefs who moved with military precision, into the private dining room that had been set up for the evening. The room was stunning in that understated way that screamed old money, with dark wood paneling and subtle lighting that made everyone look 10 years younger and 50 pounds richer, a single long table set with china that probably cost more than Maya's car, assuming her car hadn't been repossessed last month. The other servers were given their assignments, but Maya was told she'd be floating, helping wherever needed, which she knew from experience meant doing the jobs nobody else wanted to do while getting blamed if anything went wrong. The guests began arriving at 7 p.m., emerging from luxury cars that probably cost more than most people's houses, their designer clothes, and effortless confidence, filling the private dining room with an energy that made Maya feel like an intruder in her own life. Marcus Chen arrived first, and Maya recognized him from the tech news articles she'd seen online. A man in his early 40s with silver-rimmed glasses, and the kind of casual, expensive style that came from having personal shoppers who knew exactly which designer jeans to pair with which handmade Italian shoes. He moved through the room like he owned it, which technically he did for the evening, checking details with the maitre d', and occasionally glancing at his phone with the distracted air of someone whose attention was worth millions of dollars per minute. The other guests filtered in, a collection of venture capitalists, tech executives, and their impossibly beautiful partners who probably had careers of their own, but were treated as accessories by the men who dominated every conversation. Maya stationed herself near the wall, trying to embody that perfect service invisibility that good waiters cultivated, present enough to notice when a water glass needed refilling, but absent enough that guests forgot you were human and said things they probably shouldn't. One of the other servers, a tall guy named James, who Denise had introduced earlier, leaned close and whispered that the brunette in the red dress was Sarah Mitchell, founder of a startup that had just raised $50 million in Series B funding, and the older gentleman holding court near the window was David Parr, who'd sold his cloud computing company for $2 billion, and now spent his time deciding which entrepreneurs deserved funding and which deserved bankruptcy. The conversation in the room was exactly what Maya expected, a mixture of business talk disguised as casual chat, discussions of market trends and disruption and synergy that all basically meant finding new ways to make rich people richer, while convincing themselves they were changing the world. Marcus kept checking his watch and Maya realized he was waiting for someone, probably his father, the mysterious Italian patriarch, who'd apparently built the foundation for Marcus's empire before retiring to Florence or Rome or wherever rich people went when they decided working was beneath them. The first course was about to be served when the door opened again, and an elderly man entered the room with the kind of presence that made everyone else seem somehow less significant. He was in his 70s, Maya guessed, with thick white hair swept back from a face that showed every year he'd lived but wore them well, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her annual salary but wore it like it was a comfortable sweater. What struck Maya immediately was his eyes, bright and sharp despite his age, scanning the room with an intensity that suggested he missed nothing, evaluated everything, and had already formed opinions about every person present. Marcus rushed forward, embracing his father with genuine warmth that was the first authentic emotion Maya had seen from him all evening, and the old man smiled, patting his son's back while saying something in Italian that made Marcus laugh. The maitre d' guided the elderly Miss Chen to the head of the table, the seat of honor that had been left conspicuously empty, and the other guests adjusted themselves accordingly, their body language shifting to orient toward this new center of gravity that had entered the room. Maya found herself studying the old man as she filled water glasses, noting the way he greeted each guest with personalized attention, asking questions that suggested he'd actually listened to what Marcus had told him about these people, making connections and observations that demonstrated a sharp mind that age hadn't dulled. When she approached to fill his water glass, he looked up at her with those penetrating eyes, and for a moment Maya felt completely exposed, like he could see through her professional mask straight down to her overdrawn bank account and disconnection notice. He thanked her in English with just a trace of an Italian accent, the words simple but delivered with a courtesy that felt genuine rather than performative, and Maya nodded, moving away before she could do something stupid like burst into tears from the simple kindness of being acknowledged as a human being. The first course arrived, some complicated arrangement of scallops and microgreens that Chef Antoine had probably spent hours perfecting, and Maya helped distribute the plates while trying not to think about how this single course probably cost more than her grocery budget for a month. The conversation flowed around her as she worked, the guests discussing artificial intelligence and market valuations and regulatory challenges, their words painting a picture of a world so far removed from her daily struggle that they might as well have been speaking about life on Mars. Marcus was in his element, holding court at his end of the table while occasionally glancing at his father for approval, and the old man listened more than he spoke, occasionally nodding or asking a question that somehow shifted the entire direction of the conversation. Maya caught fragments of his story from the dinner talk, how he'd immigrated to America from Italy in the 1970s, built a small import business from nothing, worked 18-hour days, while living in a studio apartment not unlike the one Maya currently inhabits, slowly expanding until he had enough money to invest in real estate and tech startups back when Silicon Valley was still mostly orchard. The familiar immigrant success story that America loved to tell itself, the one that conveniently ignored all the people who worked just as hard and stayed poor, the ones like Maya's parents who'd followed the same playbook but never caught the breaks that turned effort into empire. The dinner progressed through its carefully orchestrated courses, each plate a masterpiece of culinary engineering that the guests photographed before eating, their phones capturing images for social media posts that would make their followers simultaneously hungry and envious. Maya moved through her duties on autopilot, refilling glasses and clearing plates while her mind wandered to the electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter and the conversation she needed to have with her landlord about extending her rent payment deadline. She was clearing the fourth course, some deconstructed interpretation of risotto that had left most of the guests confused about whether they were supposed to eat it with a fork or a spoon, when she overheard two of the servers near the kitchen entrance speaking rapid Italian to each other, their voices low but animated as they discussed something about Chef Antoine and a missing ingredient. Maya had studied Italian in college, one of those elective choices made by a younger version of herself, who thought knowing multiple languages would make her more marketable to international firms, and while she was rusty from lack of practice, she understood enough to gather that there was some kind of crisis brewing regarding the next course. She approached them carefully, keeping her voice quiet, and asked in Italian if everything was all right, the words feeling strange in her mouth after years of disuse, but coming back with surprising ease once she started. Both servers turned to her with expressions of shock, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking, and one of them, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, responded in rapid Italian that explained the situation in detail. Apparently, Chef Antoine's special truffle oil, the one he'd imported specifically for tonight's sixth course, had somehow been left at his other restaurant across town, and he was currently having a meltdown of operatic proportions in the kitchen, while trying to decide whether to send someone to retrieve it, or attempt to substitute with an inferior product and hope nobody noticed. Maya suggested in Italian that perhaps one of the servers could call the other restaurant and have someone bring it over immediately, and Rosa looked at her like she'd just solved world hunger, grabbing her phone to make the call while thanking Maya profusely in Italian that included several religious references and at least one mention of the Virgin Mary. The brief conversation had taken place near enough to the dining room entrance that the elderly Miss Chen had apparently overheard, because when Maya turned around she found him watching her with an expression of surprise mixed with something else she couldn't quite identify, his water glass raised halfway to his lips and frozen there as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. Their eyes met across the space and Maya felt her stomach drop as she realized what had just happened, that she'd essentially revealed herself as someone who spoke Italian in a setting where she was supposed to be invisible, anonymous, just another faceless server delivering food and removing plates. She quickly looked away, returning to her duties with burning cheeks, but she could feel his gaze following her as she moved around the room, a weight of attention that made her self-conscious about every movement. The fifth course was served without incident, a delicate preparation of duck that inspired the kind of reverent silence usually reserved for religious experiences, and Maya tried to make herself even more invisible than before, staying close to the walls and avoiding the head of the table where the old man sat. But as she was refilling wine glasses on the opposite end of the table, she heard him call out in Italian, his voice carrying across the conversations, asking if the young lady who spoke Italian could please come to his end of the table. The room fell silent immediately, all eyes turning to locate the person he was addressing, and Maya felt every molecule in her body urging her to pretend she hadn't heard, to keep moving, to somehow avoid this moment that felt like standing on a stage under a spotlight, while completely unprepared for the performance. But training and professional obligation won out over instinct, and she made her way to the head of the table where he sat, her hands trembling slightly as she approached with what she hoped was a neutral professional expression. When she reached, he smiled up at her with genuine warmth and asked in Italian where she had learned to speak the language so well, his tone conversational and kind rather than interrogative. as if they were old friends catching up rather than a billionaire's father and a broke waitress whose worlds should never intersect. Maya responded in Italian, explaining briefly about her college studies, keeping her answer short and professional, but he continued the conversation, asking which region's dialect she had studied, whether she had ever visited Italy, what had drawn her to the language in the first place. His questions felt genuine rather than performative, like he was actually interested in her answers rather than just making conversation, and Maya found herself responding more naturally, her Italian improving as the conversation continued and her nervousness faded slightly. The other guests watched this exchange with varying expressions of confusion and curiosity, unable to follow the Italian conversation but clearly aware that something unusual was happening, that the evening's script had somehow been disrupted by this interaction between the guest of honor and a server who was supposed to be background scenery. Marcus Chen was watching the interaction between his father and Maya with growing confusion that bordered on alarm, clearly uncomfortable with his carefully planned evening being derailed by an impromptu Italian conversation with the help. He interrupted politely but firmly, switching to English and asking if everything was all right, if his father needed anything, the subtext clear that what he really wanted was for this strange interaction to end and for the dinner to return to its proper social order. But the elderly Mr. Chen waved off his son's concern with a gesture that was both dismissive and affectionate, continuing to address Maya in Italian while explaining to his son in English that he was simply delighted to discover someone who spoke his native language with such proper pronunciation that it reminded him of home in a way he hadn't expected to experience tonight. He then did something that made everyone at the table visibly uncomfortable, gesturing to the empty chair beside him, the one that had been left vacant for reasons of table symmetry, and inviting Maya in Italian to sit down and join them for a moment, to rest her feet and share where she had learned to speak Florentine Italian specifically, because that was his hometown, and hearing those particular inflections was like hearing his mother's voice across the decades. Maya froze, caught between professional protocol that screamed she absolutely should not sit at a table with guests and the direct request from the guest of honor, who was currently looking at her with such hopeful expectation that refusing felt cruel. She glanced at Denis, who stood near the kitchen entrance with an expression of pure panic, then at the maître d', who looked like he was calculating how quickly he could intervene without causing a scene. But before anyone could make a decision, the old man was standing, pulling out the chair himself, and speaking in rapid Italian about how class distinctions were artificial constructs that his generation had worked too hard to escape to then impose on others, and wouldn't she please humor an old man who rarely got to speak his native language anymore. The authority in his voice, combined with the kindness in his eyes, made refusal impossible, and Maya found herself sitting in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, acutely aware of every eye in the room watching her cross a social boundary that wasn't supposed to be crossed. The old man asked her name, and when she told him, he smiled and said that Chen was a good strong name, that his wife had been a Chen before they married. And did Maya know that in some regions of Italy there were Chinese immigrant communities that went back over 100 years, merchants and traders who had made lives for themselves in foreign lands just as he had done in America? He asked about her family, where they were from, what her parents did, and Maya found herself telling him about the grocery store in Sacramento, about her mother's health problems and her father's long hours, about the college degree that hadn't led to the career she'd imagined, the words spilling out in a mixture of Italian and English that reflected her emotional state, vulnerable and honest in a way she hadn't been with anyone in months. The other guests had returned to their own conversations, though Maya could feel their sideways glances and whispered comments, could sense Marcus Chen's discomfort even without looking at him directly, but the old man seemed oblivious or indifferent to the social disruption he'd caused, focused entirely on Maya's story with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. He told her about his own journey, speaking in Italian that flowed like poetry, about arriving in America with $200 and a suitcase full of hope, about working in restaurant kitchens and construction sites while teaching himself English at night, about the loneliness of being an immigrant in a country that simultaneously promised everything and delivered very little unless you fought for every inch. He spoke about his wife, Maya's namesake ancestor, who had worked as a seamstress while pregnant with Marcus, her fingers bleeding from needle pricks as she sewed wedding dresses for wealthy American women who would never know her name. and how they had built their success not through luck or connections, but through stubborn refusal to accept the limitations society tried to impose on them. His words carried weight not because they were unique, but because they were delivered with such genuine emotion, without the performative inspiration that characterized most success stories, just honest acknowledgement of struggle and survival and the random chances that separated those who made it from those who didn't. Maya felt tears threatening and blinked them back hard, aware that crying at a billionaire's dinner party while sitting at the table instead of serving it would be the final nail in the coffin of her already struggling career. But the old man noticed anyway and handed her his napkin, expensive linen that was probably worth more than her entire outfit, speaking softly in Italian about how there was no shame in acknowledging hardship, that the problem with America was everyone pretended struggle didn't exist, made it invisible and therefore made the people experiencing it feel invisible too. The sixth course arrived, Chef Antoine's truffle creation that had caused all the earlier drama, and the old man reluctantly released Maya back to her duties, but not before taking her hand in both of his, and saying something in Italian that translated roughly to "May God keep you in the palm of his hand and bring you to where you're meant to be," a blessing that carried the weight of genuine prayer rather than empty platitude. Maya returned to her position near the wall, her heart pounding and her mind reeling from the surreal interaction, aware that every other server was staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to envy to outright hostility at the attention she'd received. Denise grabbed her arm as she passed, hissing a whispered demand for explanation that Maya couldn't provide because she didn't understand it herself, didn't know why a wealthy elderly man had decided to temporarily adopt her as someone worth acknowledging, rather than ignoring like everyone else in his economic bracket seemed to do. The dinner continued through its final course and into dessert, a complicated construction of chocolate and gold leaf that seemed designed more for Instagram than actual consumption, and Maya forced herself back into professional mode, moving through her duties with mechanical efficiency while trying to process what had just happened. The guests began departing around 10 p.m., calling for their luxury cars and saying their goodbyes with the casual confidence of people who would see each other again at the next exclusive event, and Maya helped with the cleanup, stacking plates and folding linens while the other servers either avoided her or shot her questioning looks. She didn't have energy to address. She was collecting wine glasses from the table when she realized the elderly Miss Chen was still there, standing near the window with Marcus. The two of them engaged in what looked like an intense conversation conducted in low voices that suggested father-son dynamics that transcended their wealth. Marcus looked frustrated, gesturing occasionally toward where Maya worked, while his father remained calm, speaking with the patient firmness of someone who had won this argument before it even started. Finally, Marcus threw up his hands in a gesture of defeat and walked away, pulling out his phone to presumably deal with whatever crisis required his immediate attention, leaving his father alone by the window. The old man caught Maya's eye and gestured for her to approach, and she did so reluctantly, aware that she'd already violated enough professional boundaries for one evening and half expecting to be reprimanded despite his earlier kindness. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, but not the kind Maya was expecting, not Marcus's venture capital firm or some tech company, but something simpler, a cream-colored card with elegant script that read Giovanni Chen and listed an address in Florence along with a phone number. He handed it to her and explained in English now, perhaps aware that others might be listening, that he owned several restaurants in Italy, traditional places that served real Italian food to real Italian people, rather than the tourist traps that lined every major piazza, and that he was always looking for people who understood service, who spoke the language, who knew what it meant to work hard for every dollar they earned. He said that if she ever wanted to leave Seattle to try something different, to spend some time in Italy, learning the restaurant business from people who'd been doing it for generations, she should call him, that he would arrange everything. Sometimes the best opportunities came from the most unexpected places. Maya stared at the card, her mind unable to process what she was hearing, because people like her didn't get offers like this, didn't get escape routes handed to them by wealthy strangers at private dinners, didn't get chances to leave their struggles behind and start over in foreign countries. She started to protest, to say that she couldn't possibly accept, that she didn't deserve this kind of generosity, but he stopped her with a raised hand and said in Italian that deserving had nothing to do with it, that he recognized in her the same hunger he'd seen in himself 50 years ago, the same determination mixed with exhaustion that came from fighting against a system designed to keep you in place, and that if he could help someone escape that trap, even just one person, then maybe all the success and wealth he'd accumulated actually meant something. He told her that the offer had no expiration date, that the card would remain valid whether she called tomorrow, or next year or 10 years from now, that sometimes opportunities needed time to be recognized as opportunities, rather than threats or tricks. Maya managed to thank him, her voice barely above a whisper, and he smiled and said something about how she reminded him of his wife when they'd first met, that same combination of strength and vulnerability, pride and desperation, beauty that came from surviving rather than being sheltered. Then Marcus returned, interrupting the moment with reminders about early morning meetings and long flights, and Giovanni Chen said goodbye to Maya with a final blessing in Italian, before following his son out into the Seattle night, where a black car waited to transport them back to whatever temporary luxury accommodations billionaires used when visiting their children. Maya stood in the empty dining room after the last guest had departed, the business card in her pocket, feeling like it was burning through the fabric, impossible to ignore even though she'd tried to focus on the cleanup and the final tasks of the evening. Denise cornered her near the kitchen, demanding to know what had happened, what the old man had said to her, why she'd been invited to sit at the table like she was a guest instead of help, and Maya tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and incomplete, because she didn't fully understand it herself. The truth was that nothing about the evening made sense according to the rules she'd learned about how the world worked, about how people in different social classes didn't interact beyond necessary transactions, about how opportunities for people like her came through grinding effort and careful networking rather than random acts of kindness from elderly Italian billionaires. Denise looked at her with an expression that mixed skepticism with envy, clearly not believing that Maya's fluent Italian had somehow resulted in anything beyond a pleasant conversation, and Maya didn't bother pulling out the business card to prove it, because she knew that would only make things worse, would turn envy into resentment and create problems she didn't need. The maître handed her an envelope at the end of the night, the promised $300 in cash that felt surreal after everything that had happened, and she thanked him quietly before heading out into the Seattle darkness where rain had started falling again, that perpetual Pacific Northwest drizzle that made everything damp and cold and vaguely depressing. The bus ride home took an hour, giving Maya plenty of time to replay every moment of the evening, analyzing each conversation like she was studying for an exam, trying to determine if Giovanni Chen's offer had been genuine, or just the kind of empty promise wealthy people made when they were feeling momentarily generous but would forget by morning. She pulled out the business card multiple times, studying the elegant script, running her finger over the embossed lettering, trying to decide if this was really her ticket out of the endless cycle of double shifts and overdue bills, or just another disappointment waiting to happen. Her studio apartment greeted her with its familiar smell of old carpet and the faint mildew that no amount of cleaning could eliminate, the disconnection notice from the power company still sitting on her counter exactly where she'd left it that morning, a reminder that regardless of what had happened tonight, her immediate reality remained unchanged. She counted out the $300, setting aside $200 for rent and keeping the remaining $100 for food and bus fare, the mental math a depressing ritual she'd perfected over the past year. Sleep didn't come easily that night, her mind racing with possibilities and doubts in equal measure, imagining scenarios where she called the number on the card and discovered it was disconnected, or where she actually went to Italy and discovered the whole thing had been some elaborate misunderstanding, or where she called and found out that yes, the offer was real, but accepting it meant leaving behind everything she knew, her family, her language, her country, for a chance that might lead nowhere. The morning arrived too quickly, her alarm jarring her awake after only 4 hours of sleep, and she dragged herself to Carson's diner for her regular shift, the business card still in her pocket like a talisman or a curse. She couldn't decide. Work was exactly the same as always, the same demanding customers leaving the same terrible tips, the same manager making the same passive-aggressive comments about her efficiency, the same grinding exhaustion that accumulated in her bones like sediment at the bottom of a river. She mentioned nothing about the previous night to anyone, keeping Giovanni's offer locked away like a secret that might disappear if exposed to light, and instead moved through her day with the same mechanical efficiency she'd developed as a survival skill. But something had changed. Some fundamental shift in how she viewed her circumstances, because now every time a customer was rude or a tip was insultingly small or her manager criticized some minor mistake, she found herself thinking about that business card, about the possibility of escape, about whether staying in Seattle fighting for scraps was actually strength and determination or just fear of the unknown disguised as persistence. She called her mother that evening, the first time in 3 weeks, and listened to the familiar litany of concerns and questions, her mom's voice carrying that mixture of love and disappointment that Maya had learned to brace herself against. She wanted to tell her mother about Giovanni, about the offer, about the possibility of going to Italy, but the words wouldn't come because she knew what the response would be: warnings about strangers and unrealistic dreams, and the importance of steady employment even if it barely paid enough to survive. Instead, she listened and made appropriate sounds of agreement and promised to visit soon, knowing that soon meant whenever she could afford gas money for the drive to Sacramento, which based on current finances would be sometime around never. 3 weeks passed before Maya gathered enough courage to actually call the number on Giovanni's card. 3 weeks of carrying it everywhere, pulling it out at random moments, rehearsing conversations in her head that never happened, convincing herself that tomorrow would be the right day to make the call, and then finding excuses why tomorrow needed to become next week. The disconnection notice had escalated to a final warning. Her landlord had started mentioning eviction with increasing frequency, and Carson's diner had cut her hours because business was slow, which was code for the owner wanted to hire his nephew and needed to free up shifts. Maya was spiraling toward a crisis that felt both inevitable and somehow surprising, as if years of barely surviving had led to this exact moment where survival was no longer possible without drastic change. She made the call on a Tuesday morning, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone twice before the line connected, and when a woman answered in rapid Italian, Maya nearly hung up before forcing herself to respond in the same language, asking to speak with Maya Chen and explaining who she was and why she was calling. There was a long pause, some muffled conversation in the background, and then Giovanni's voice came through the line, warm and immediately familiar despite the weeks that had passed, greeting her like they were continuing a conversation from earlier that day, rather than picking up a thread from 3 weeks prior. He asked how she was doing, and Maya found herself telling him the truth about the mounting bills and the reduced hours and the apartment she was probably going to lose, the words spilling out in Italian that flowed more naturally now that desperation had overcome self-consciousness. Giovanni listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment before asking a single question in English, careful and direct, whether she was calling because she wanted the opportunity he'd offered, or because she was simply desperate and saw him as a solution to her immediate problems. The question cut through Maya's rehearsed speeches and careful justification, forcing her to examine her own motivations with uncomfortable honesty, and after a long pause she answered in Italian that maybe it was both. Maybe desperation was just another word for being ready to take chances you wouldn't take if you had the luxury of security, and maybe that wasn't such a terrible thing. Giovanni laughed, a sound of genuine delight that came through clearly despite the distance, and said that this was exactly the kind of honest answer he'd hoped to hear, that desperation had been the mother of his own success, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or had never actually been desperate. He told her that if she was serious, truly serious about coming to Italy and learning the restaurant business from the ground up, he could arrange everything within 2 weeks, that she'd work in his flagship restaurant in Florence, starting as a server but with opportunities to learn every aspect of the operation from kitchen to management, that she'd be paid a fair wage by Italian standards, which was admittedly less than American minimums, but combined with provided housing, would actually give her more financial stability than she currently had. The offer was real, tangible, specific enough that Maya couldn't dismiss it as a wealthy man's empty promise, and she found herself saying yes before her rational mind could list all the reasons this was insane, before fear could override the desperate hope that had been building since the night of that dinner. Giovanni told her he'd have his assistant arrange the paperwork, that she should expect emails with visa information and flight details, that she shouldn't worry about the logistics because he'd handled situations like this before and knew exactly what needed to happen. He asked her to promise only one thing, that she would give this opportunity at least 6 months, that she wouldn't quit after 2 weeks when homesickness and culture shock hit, that she'd push through the difficult adjustment period to see if this path actually led somewhere. Maya promised, her voice steadier than she felt, and Giovanni said something in Italian about how life's biggest regrets came from chances not taken rather than chances that failed, and then they said goodbye. And Maya sat in her tiny apartment staring at her phone like it was an alien artifact that had just changed her entire existence. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of bureaucratic necessities and emotional goodbye, rushing between government offices for visa paperwork and meeting with her landlord to break her lease. The latter conversation easier than expected because he was already advertising her apartment online before she'd finished explaining she was leaving. She told her parents she was moving to Italy for a job opportunity, keeping the details vague because she knew they'd try to talk her out of it if they understood the full situation. Her mother's response a mixture of concern and confusion about why she couldn't find a good job in America if she'd already spent all that money on college. Denise helped her sell most of her possessions, the accumulated stuff of 3 years in Seattle, reduced to whatever could fit in 2 suitcases, and Maya was surprised to discover how little actually mattered when you were starting over, how most of what she owned was just weight rather than value. The flight from Seattle to Florence with a connection through London took nearly 20 hours and gave Maya plenty of time to question every decision that had led her to this moment, sitting in economy class with her knees pressed against the seat in front of her, while a baby screamed somewhere behind her, and a man to her left snored with the volume and rhythm of a chainsaw. She'd never left the United States before, had barely left the West Coast, and the enormity of what she was doing hit her somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, where looking out the window showed nothing but endless water and clouds, no landmarks or reference points, just the terrifying reality that she was literally leaving everything she knew behind based on a conversation with a stranger and a business card that might still turn out to be an elaborate prank. The London airport was a maze of terminals and security checkpoints, everyone moving with the efficient impatience of experienced travelers, while Maya clutched her passport and boarding pass and tried not to look as lost as she felt, eventually finding her connecting flight with only minutes to spare before boarding closed. The second flight was shorter but more turbulent, the plane bucking and dropping through pockets of air that made her stomach lurch and wonder if dying in a plane crash somewhere over the Alps was the universe's way of telling her this whole plan had been a terrible idea. But then they descended through clouds and suddenly there was Italy below, patchwork fields and ancient towns and mountains in the distance, everything looking exactly like the photos but somehow more real, more immediate, more terrifying than any photograph could capture. The Florence airport was smaller than she'd expected, less overwhelming than London had been, and she navigated customs and baggage claim in a daze of exhaustion and adrenaline, her Italian improving with each interaction as if proximity to its native speakers was activating dormant parts of her brain. Giovanni had arranged for someone to meet her, a young man named Paolo, who held a sign with her name, spelled correctly, and greeted her with the kind of casual warmth that seemed uniquely Italian, kissing both her cheeks before grabbing her larger suitcase and leading her to a small car that looked like it had survived several wars and was ready for more. The drive from the airport into Florence proper was a sensory overload that made Maya's jet-lagged brain struggle to process everything at once, Paolo narrating in rapid Italian while navigating streets that seemed designed for vehicles half the size of modern cars, pointing out landmarks and churches and piazzas, like they were casual neighborhood features rather than monuments that appeared in art history textbooks. The apartment Giovanni had arranged was on the 3rd floor of a building that had probably stood since the Renaissance, up a narrow staircase that made carrying luggage an aerobic workout, but when Paolo opened the door and showed her inside, Maya felt something in her chest release tension she hadn't known she was carrying. The apartment was small but beautiful in that specifically Italian way, with high ceilings and shuttered windows that opened onto a view of terracotta roofs and a church bell tower, furnished simply but comfortably, everything clean and ready and somehow more welcoming than anywhere she'd lived in Seattle. Paolo explained in Italian that he worked as a line cook at Giovanni's main restaurant, that he lived in the building too on the floor below, that if she needed anything or had questions she should just knock and he'd help, that everyone who worked for Giovanni became family and took care of each other. He left her to settle in, and Maya stood at the window watching the sun set over Florence, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and allowed herself to believe just for a moment, that maybe this terrifying leap into the unknown was actually going to work out. The restaurant where she'd be working was only a 10-minute walk away, Paolo had explained, and she was expected to arrive at 9 a.m. the next morning to meet with Giovanni and begin her training, which gave her exactly one evening to get over her jet lag and convince her brain to start operating on Italian time. She attempted this through a combination of staying awake, despite exhaustion, wandering the narrow streets near her apartment while trying not to get lost, and stopping at a small cafe where she ordered pasta carbonara that tasted nothing like the versions she'd served at Romano's and everything like what food was supposed to taste like when made by people who actually cared. The other diners paid her no attention, didn't mark her as foreign or different, just another person eating dinner in a city where eating dinner was taken seriously, and Maya felt herself beginning to relax in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The constant tension of survival mode starting to unwind now that she was somewhere new without the weight of her accumulated failures following her around. She found her way back to her apartment as the church bells rang 9 p.m., collapsed into bed with her clothes still on, and slept dreamlessly for 12 hours straight, her body finally convinced it was safe enough to stop being constantly vigilant. Maya woke to church bells and sunlight streaming through the shutters, momentarily disoriented, before remembering where she was and why, the reality of her new life settling over her like a blanket that was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. She dressed carefully in the black pants and white shirt Paolo had told her to wear, pinned back her hair the way she always did for restaurant work, and walked through Florence's morning streets, where locals were buying bread and drinking espresso while tourists with cameras hadn't yet emerged from their hotels. The restaurant, Trattoria Chen, occupied the ground floor of a building that looked medieval, its entrance modest and unmarked except for a small wooden sign, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing, unless you knew to look for it. Giovanni himself answered her knock, wearing an apron over casual clothes, his sleeves rolled up and flour on his hands, looking more like a working cook than a wealthy businessman, and he greeted her in Italian with genuine warmth before leading her inside to a dining room that was simple and perfect, wooden tables and chairs worn smooth by decades of use, walls decorated with photographs of family rather than generic Italian scenery, everything authentic in a way that Romano's had tried and failed to approximate. The kitchen was already busy despite the early hour, a team of 5 cooks working in the kind of synchronized harmony that came from years of cooking together, preparing fresh pasta and sauces and ingredients for the day's service, and Giovanni introduced Maya to each of them in turn, their names and positions and the brief backgrounds that established she was joining a family rather than just taking a job. He explained in Italian that she'd start by observing, learning how a real Italian restaurant operated, understanding the philosophy behind every dish and every decision, and only after she'd absorbed this foundation would she begin serving, and only after she'd mastered serving would she be allowed to cook. Maya spent that first day watching everything with the intensity of someone taking a test she couldn't afford to fail, noting how the pasta was made fresh every morning, how the sauces used ingredients from specific local suppliers who'd been working with the restaurant for generations, how nothing was rushed or compromised, every dish treated with respect, even if it was simple peasant food rather than elaborate haute cuisine. Giovanni worked alongside his staff, not directing from above, but actually cooking, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been making pasta since before Maya was born, occasionally explaining techniques or philosophies in Italian that Maya absorbed like a desperate student. The lunch service started at noon, and Maya watched as a steady stream of locals filled the dining room, regulars who knew the staff by name and ordered without looking at menu, families celebrating ordinary Tuesdays with food that was treated as important rather than fuel, the whole atmosphere relaxed but attentive in a way that American restaurants never quite achieved. She served tables in the afternoon, Giovanni watching her carefully and offering corrections in Italian that were firm but better cruel, teaching her that service here meant something different than it had in Seattle, meant being present without being intrusive, meant understanding food well enough to explain it rather than just delivering plates, meant treating every customer with the same respect regardless of whether they ordered the expensive wine or just water. The day stretched into evening, and Maya's feet hurt and her back ached and her brain was exhausted from operating entirely in Italian for 12 straight hours, but underneath the physical exhaustion was something else, a feeling she had to search her memory to identify because it had been so long since she'd experienced it, the feeling of purpose, of being somewhere she was supposed to be, of work that mattered beyond just generating enough money to not starve. Giovanni walked her home after service ended at 10 p.m., the streets quieter now but still alive with people finishing dinner or starting their evening, and he asked her in Italian how she was feeling, whether this was what she'd expected, whether she thought she could actually do. Maya answered honestly that she had no idea if she could do it, that everything felt foreign and overwhelming, and completely different from anything she'd known, but that for the first time in years she felt like she was moving towards something rather than just running from her failure. And wasn't that worth the fear and uncertainty? Giovanni smiled and said something about how courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, and that he saw in her the same stubborn determination that had carried him from poverty in Italy to success in America, and now back to Italy again, this time as someone who could help others make similar journeys. They reached her building, and he told her that tomorrow would be just as long and just as difficult, that the next 6 months would test her in ways she couldn't anticipate, but that if she survived them she'd have not just a job but a skill, not just a paycheck but a purpose, not just an escape from poverty but a foundation for something better. Maya climbed the stairs to her apartment, collapsed on her bed without bothering to undress, and stared at the ceiling where shadows from streetlights played across plaster that had probably absorbed centuries of similar moments, other people in other eras making similar leaps into unknown futures, and she felt connected to something larger than her individual struggle, part of a human story about survival and reinvention that transcended borders and time periods. The church bells rang midnight, marking the end of her first day in her new life, and Maya closed her eyes and let sleep take her, exhausted but hopeful, broke but no longer broke, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The business card that had started all of this now tucked away in a drawer, but its promise fulfilled. The impossible made real through nothing more complicated than one person recognizing another person's humanity and deciding to help despite all the social rules that said such help shouldn't be given.